him smearing feces on a bathroom wall.
Ball of feces found in JONBENET's bed. They apparently found feces spread on a box of candy that she had gotten the day before for Christmas.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this analysis, we are admittedly going to take things to extremes, in a sense, in terms of something we don't like to do very much and we try not to do on this channel, and that is to make assumptions and speculate. So I do think what gives us potential reinforcement, shitty intertextuality if you like, is the box of candy smeared with feces observed apparently by CSIs in JONBENET's bedroom. As I say, it's highly doubtful, not impossible, just improbable, that little JONBENET would do that to her own box of candies. So if we are talking about not just a ball of dung, but a dung ball perpetrator, someone brought their dung to JONBENET's bed, to her bedroom, someone deliberately placing it there, then the reason could be to, number one, exert a form of control, and that's someone who probably is not feeling that they have control otherwise. And then number two, gain a sense of power over their world. And that's also someone who's perhaps not feeling very powerful in their world, in their life. But the result could also be that JONBENET wouldn't want to sleep in that bed, and then who would? If we are dealing with a dung ball perpetrator, then we are dealing with a sadistic psychology in the sense of getting gratification out of hurting, getting pleasure, taking pleasure out of offending or disgusting someone else. It's an interesting question to ask. What might be the roots of such sadism if such sadism was present? But it's also important to remember that playing with dung may not start out as a sadistic impulse. It may begin as a healthy psychological impulse. As Becker puts it, as a human animal, the child himself discovers the main ironic paradox of his existence, that in everything specifically human, everything that expresses his noblest inner symbolic urges, he is nevertheless bound to a stinking animal body. If we apply Becker's thinking to the Ramsey case, what the poo potentially does here is provide a grounding for all of that flowery extravagance, that fake pageantry, that perfumed, dyed, dressed up, coiffed, made up, bogus tomfoolery, by essentially drawing a shit-smelling line through all of it and saying, no, life is real, life is stinky, and let's get real about it. In other words, it might be a fairly legitimate protest, if you think about it, about an overly burdensome symbology. Think about overly burdensome symbology in the context of you want to celebrate Christmas, and there's all of this stress around trying to put a Christmas tree into every single room, and we've got to get everything perfect. And doesn't that detract from the joy of Christmas? Well, it might, if it is overly burdensome, the symbology. You might enjoy a pageant and like a beauty pageant, unless there's just so many photo shoots and it just is going over the top. And then now it's crossing a couple of lines in terms of what is normal and perhaps what is extreme. And then it might feel like an overly burdensome symbology. And think about the Ramsey case and the ransom note. Is the ransom note not an overly burdensome aspect to what actually happened in that case? If you consider all of that beyond all of the pageantry, you know, the Ramseys were also Christians, and perhaps at times all of it felt to someone particularly overwhelming, even suffocating. I'm talking about that potentially burdensome symbology.
This is the nature of the universe. We struggle against it, we fight to deny it.
So, of course, this is just one interpretation based on a number of assumptions. Another might be that we are seeing the signs of a child who is struggling to cope with simply being a child. But what caused that? Plenty of children do cope under similar circumstances. So what was so difficult to cope with in this case? Well, think about a young parent getting cancer, serious cancer, stage 4 cancer, and then over the course of a year, fighting for her life, fighting to stay alive, fighting to survive. And this is not just anyone getting cancer. It's a beauty queen mom who's desperately trying not to die. You know, her life is really taking off. And she suddenly loses her hair. I mean, I think it's 10 times worse if you're a trophy wife and you lose your looks. What else do you have to rely on? And, you know, she's bedridden. She can't keep her food down. She's sick. Perhaps she gets diarrhea and whatnot. And is she going to go gently into the night, or is there going to be a certain degree of hysteria? I mean, we are dealing with Patsy getting cancer. And so how is Patsy going to deal with it? Calmly and gently, or emotionally? And who wouldn't be under those circumstances? You know, when faced with the death of her own daughter, whether there was pageantry involved or not, Patsy was so hysterical, it prompted the unnerved cops to summon not one but 2 victim advocates. And I'm not sure if I've ever heard of another true crime case where victim advocates were summoned to the crime scene. You know, and that's on top of the pastor who was in attendance already and the 4 friends providing moral support. And we get a real sense of Patsy's hysteria during that 911 call where she hung up on the operator. You don't see that every day either. So if Patsy dealt with JonBenet's death in this way, how did she deal with the prospect of her own death? I mean, over days, weeks, and months. Also consider how, in a physical health sense, when someone has cancer, there is regression. I mean, another word for being terminally ill is physical regression. But consider what sort of impact that might have had on a young child that is in the same house, a child that, until the cancer has been given love and attention and a wonderful home, you know, as many gifts as they want, and, you know, just a wonderful life. A child that has been progressing in certain respects, actualizing, but now has to take the sudden absence of that along with death anxiety, the absence of the nurturing parent, and then on top of that, they've got to deal with death anxiety. And suddenly there's no one to provide psychological support. Perhaps a nanny here and there, but the primary caregiver is now fundamentally, if temporarily, removed. And this happens at a time where the child is particularly vulnerable, without any of the emotional or psychological armory required to deal with the colossal circumstances at hand. This would be difficult for a teenager or a young adult or even an adult. It's particularly difficult for a child that hasn't developed these resources over time. And so I think in the simplest terms, Patsy's cancer manifested as one thing in her 2 young children: anxiety. Did they have the tools to soothe that anxiety? Does any child have the tools to deal with this level of anxiety?
Can you wipe out that much red?
Normally, a parent would perform that role in terms of soothing, except now, from a certain point of view, the parent is actually the source of that anxiety. Just think about the existential dread being in that situation. And when a child or anyone feels anxious, how do they feel? Well, out of control.
It is a lie. Beneath our poised appearance, the truth is we are completely out of control.
So regression is not only a failure to deal with anxiety, it's a defense mechanism. It's dysfunctional, but it's also just something the ill-equipped child tries to fall back on. So isn't the regression of the parent mirrored perhaps in the regression of a child apparently in their care? Now, what do you think? Could we be wrong about this? Could it be JonBenet's feces in JonBenet's bed? Are we wrong about assuming it might be someone else's? Might it be JonBenet's instead?
Honestly, it might.
I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.